Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 529, Bakumatsu, Part 2. The dominance of Ii Naosuke, the tairo or chief elder of the Tokugawa shogunate, and the instigator of the so-called Ansei purges which silenced dissent against the Harris Treaty and its successors, seems, in hindsight, to be a bit of a mirage. I think it's fair to say that if you asked most people living in Japan, foreigners and locals alike, at this time, they would tell you that the tairo had successfully brought dissent to heel and had reasserted the power of the shogunate over policy. The Tokugawa Bakufu leadership of earlier years, Abe Masahiro, Hotta Masayoshi, and their ilk, had been weak and unwilling to make hard calls, but Ii was not. He was willing to do what had to be done to protect the shogunate, and he had succeeded. He'd even managed to move beyond the first stage of his tenure in office, cracking down on his opposition, onto the second. Way back in 1853, Ii had been one of the daimyo to offer advice to the Bakufu about how to handle Commodore Perry, and we still have his letter today. He advised opening the country since, quote, there is a saying that when one is besieged in a castle, to raise the drawbridge is to imprison oneself and make it impossible to hold out indefinitely. And again, that when opposing forces face each other across a river, a victory is obtained by those who cross the river and attack. It seems clear throughout history that he who takes action is in a position to advance, while he who remains inactive must retreat. And so then daimyo Ii Naosuke had recommended a diplomatic strategy of trade and negotiation with the West in order to learn from these countries and use their technology and overseas trade to strengthen Japan. As tairo, he had a chance to put this philosophy into practice, dispatching a warship, the Kanrin Maru, steam-powered and purchased from the Dutch in 1857, to the United States, for Japan's first overseas diplomatic mission since Tokugawa Ieyasu's own lifetime. One imagines the tairo was, at this point in his career, feeling pretty good about himself and how things were going, and that he must have been in a jolly mood as he made his way to the shogun's castle on March 24, 1860, for an audience to inform the boy shogun Iemochi of the status of all his various projects. Unfortunately for him, the audience would never happen. As the tairo made his way being carried in a palanquin through the Sakuraramon, the cherry blossom gate at the south end of the palace complex, his entourage of 60 guards was ambushed. His attackers numbered only 19 men, but they had a clever strategy. A group of them attacked the front of the procession, drawing the guards forward to deal with them. A smaller group waited in reserve to ambush the tairo once many of his guards had left his side. One of this number, a samurai named Arimura Jisaemon, drew a revolver, built in Japan using some of the weapons given by Commodore Perry as a model, and fired it into the tairo's carriage, wounding Ii Naosuke. Arimura then reached inside, pulled the tairo out, and beheaded him. The so-called Sakuraramon incident of 1860 was a bloody affair. In addition to Ii Naosuke's own death, 8 of his guards died in the fighting or afterwards as a result of various injuries. A further 5 were executed and 5 more sentenced to commit suicide for various degrees of cowardice in failing to defend their master. On the side of the assailants, of the 19 men involved in the attack, 6 died in the fighting, or committed suicide to avoid capture after the tairo's death. All but 4 of the rest were captured or turned themselves in, with all of those so imprisoned either beheaded or dying in prison of maltreatment. Of the 4 remaining escapees, 2 were hunted down within a year. Only 2 would survive to the end of the Tokugawa shogunate. The assailants left behind a manifesto outlining their reasons for the assassination. Quote, "While fully aware of the necessity for some change in policy since the coming of the Americans at Uraga, it is entirely against the interest of the country and a stain on the national honor to open up commercial relations with foreigners, to admit foreigners to the shogun's castle, to conclude treaties with them, to abolish the established practice of trampling on the picture of Jesus, to detect and execute secret Christians, to allow foreigners to build places of worship for their evil religion, Christianity, and to allow the 3 foreign ministers, ambassadors from overseas, to reside in the land. Under the excuse of keeping the peace, too much compromise has been made at the sacrifice of national honor. Too much fear has been shown for foreigners' threats. Not only has the national custom of seclusion been set aside and the national dignity impaired, but the policy followed by the Bakufu has not been approved by the emperor. For all this, the tairo is responsible. Our sense of patriotism could not brook this abuse of power at the hands of such a wicked rebel. Therefore, we have consecrated ourselves to be the instruments of heaven to punish this wicked man, and we have taken on ourselves the duty of ending a serious evil by killing this atrocious aristocrat." Now, whether or not the Tairo's career constituted a serious evil depended, of course, on where your sympathies lay in the tangled politics of the time. But it's pretty indisputable that without him, the shogunate found itself in a far more challenging position than it had been even the previous day. Of course, once again, the Tokugawa government faced a leadership vacuum at the top. At the time of the Tairo's death, the shogun Iemochi was only 14, and thus not really in a position to command unified respect. There also wasn't really anyone in position to take the reins in Ii Naosuke's place, which would have required a combination of both clear strategic vision and pedigree, since you had to be of a certain rank in terms of background to hold a leadership role in the Council of Regents. That sort of combination was getting increasingly rare. The only real option here was the man who had been the other candidate to become shogun in 1858, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, by this time 23, and the child of one of the Shimpan extended branches of the Tokugawa family. Unfortunately, his main political champion was his biological father, Tokugawa Nariaki. Yoshinobu was Nariaki's 3rd son, and had been adopted by another branch of the Tokugawa family. But Nariaki was not in a position to champion his biological son. He had feuded with Ii Naosuke and lost out on his influence as a result, and regardless, putting forward as a leader someone who had just barely lost out to the sitting shogun was, to put it mildly, a politically challenging proposition. And so, after Ii Naosuke's death, the shogunate floundered, listless and leaderless, and this had 2 big implications for the future. First, in the absence of strong leadership from Edo, the role of the imperial court once again began to expand. Remember, before Ii, the conservative and xenophobic Emperor Kolmei had been increasingly assertive, threatening to abdicate and withholding his approval of the Harris Treaty to try and force a political crisis and close the country once again. Ii Naosuke had brought the court to heel, largely by arresting anyone in the emperor's inner circle he deemed critical of the Bakufu's policy, but without his hand to direct the repression anymore, the atmosphere at court changed. Suddenly, the Bakufu needed the imperial court to stave up its flagging legitimacy and political power. The Bakufu leadership, rattled by Ii Naosuke's death, was no longer talking about reasserting its control over the imperial court, but about a policy of kobu gattai, the union of the aristocracy and warriors, or less poetically rendered, of the imperial court and the Bakufu. The logic of kobu gattai was simple. Without Ii Naosuke, the Bakufu lacked leadership, and regardless, having its most prominent figure assassinated did not look particularly good in terms of the political strength of the Tokugawa regime. To shore itself up, the shogunate now needed the court, and that meant the court now had leverage to extract concessions from the shogunate. This was more or less the exact advice given by one of Emperor Komei's advisors from a minor aristocratic family by the name of Iwakura Tomomi. Iwakura suggested the emperor take advantage of this to craft a marriage alliance, wedding his sister, the Princess Kazunomiya, to the boy shogun Iemochi as a symbol of the Bakufu court alliance. The proposal for this marriage had actually come from Ii Naosuke back in 1858, but it had been rejected at the time given Ii's heavy-handed treatment of the imperial court. Now, however, matters had changed. Iwakura noted the shogunate was weaker than it had been, but also felt that attempts to overthrow it were not likely to succeed and could even invite foreign intervention in a Japanese civil war. Far better to cement a marriage alliance and national unity in exchange for example, a requirement that the shogunate gradually get rid of the foreign treaties and submit any future major matters of state for the imperial court to review. Koumei agreed with this advice, and by the fall of 1860 he was busily persuading his sister to accept the match, which she eventually did, despite some pretty serious misgivings about living in a place as uncivilized as far-off Edo, which after all had only really been a city for a few hundred years, so basically brand new compared to 1,000-year-plus-old Kyoto. In the spring of 1861, Kazunomiya's entourage, surrounded by armed guards this time, the lesson of Ii Naosuke's assassination having been well learned, departed Kyoto for Edo. This birth of a new Kobugatai relationship radically changed the nature of the connection between the imperial court and the shogunate, with the shogunate for the first time accepting the notion that the emperor should have some voice in political decisions. But even this was not enough for some, which brings us back to the imperial loyalist movement we ended last week's episode with. I do want to refresh you briefly on loyalism as an ideology, but that's also hard to do because frankly it's not a very coherent worldview. Broadly, imperial loyalism grew out of a fusion of older intellectual trends like Mito-style Confucianism and Kokugaku, or national studies, with a sense of political crisis over the foreign treaties. Its basic premises were 1. That the emperor was the genesis of Japan as a nation and a symbol of its unity, 2. Any other institution was valid only as long as it upheld the emperor's will and eased his divine mind by dealing with the burdens of rule, 3. The shogunate had manifestly failed to do this, and thus 4. It was clearly no longer a legitimate government and should be overthrown with power restored to the emperor. Loyalist militancy had become a growing issue in the last few years, and particularly after Ii Naosuke's death, it exploded. The men who killed him were all loyalists, their manifesto was a classic example of loyalist logic, they were overwhelmingly from the Mito domain, which had become a hotbed for loyalist ideology. Their success in killing the tairo galvanized the loyalist movement. The imperial city of Kyoto itself became a hotbed of loyalism, with large numbers of adherents of the ideology, particularly from the lower rungs of the samurai class, those most dissatisfied with the current order, making their way to the city. There they pledged themselves to service in the emperor's name, or in the name of aristocrats who were known supporters of their movement, and busily set about attacking anyone they felt was insufficiently zealous in service to the cause. And the loyalist movement could be brutal. Many loyalists were infuriated by the marriage of Kazunomiya to the shogun, which they insisted, despite statements by the imperial court to the contrary, had been forced on her by a dictatorial shogunate over the desires of the emperor. Officials associated with the marriage were targeted for assassination. For example, the severed head of one Shimada Sakon, a follower of Kujo Hisatada, one of the pro-shogunate members of the imperial court, was found one morning at Shijo Kawara, one of the major intersections of Kyoto. His severed limbs had been separately thrown into the Takase River. Shimada was not the only one to meet this fate. Assassinations by loyalists were a constant fixture of Kyoto politics in 1862 and 1863. To say the city was under threat of violence was putting it lightly. The flocking of loyalists to the city, combined with a court that seemed on its face to be at least somewhat sanctioning their worldview, created an upwelling of anti-shogunate and anti-foreign sentiment. One might be forgiven for thinking that things were about to tip decisively against the Tokugawa regime. The Emperor Koumei, emboldened by this lack of leadership shown by the Tokugawa government, was increasingly assertive in his treatment of its officials. His 1863 New Year's message for the shogun did not just contain greetings for the season, but a restatement of the emperor's insistence that foreigners be expelled. In essence, he was giving the shogun an order. To boot, his chosen envoy, a noble named Sanjo Sanetomi, protested against the usual manner of handing over the New Year's letter, which involved the emperor's envoy prostrating himself on a lower level of the audience chamber before the shogun before the handover. He said this was degrading to the emperor's dignity. And the shogun Iemochi gave in to him on this. The letter exchange, when it did happen, happened on far less humiliating terms. And really, what choice did Iemochi have? The prestige of the Tokugawa regime was faltering. Remember, the shogun was wealthy on paper, but in reality his government was racked with debt, and at any rate was still reliant on keeping a handle on the various feudal domains, which did control the majority of the country's wealth, to govern. Given the hits that the prestige of the shogunate had taken lately, Iemochi and his supporters needed Emperor Kome, which is why they were willing to deal with being kicked around a bit in exchange for offerings of support, like that aforementioned marriage alliance between Iemochi and Kazunomiya. Iemochi even took the unprecedented step in the spring of 1863 of deciding that he would go to Kyoto personally for an audience with Emperor Kome to discuss national strategy and especially the expulsion of the foreigners. And I cannot stress enough that this was a huge step. Shoguns did not go personally to Kyoto. No shogun had done this in over 200 years. The shogun would always send deputies instead because, of course, that sent a clear message. If the shogun goes to visit the emperor at his palace, that's a message of subordination. He is coming to you. And so most shoguns carefully avoided the appearance of subordination to the court. But Iemochi had no choice but to throw himself into the pursuit of Kobugatai. Only with the help of the court could he succeed. One might be forgiven for assuming at this juncture that the power of the shogunate was faltering to such an extent, and the power of the court was growing at such a rate, that before long, the Tokugawa shogunate would be supplanted outright, that the dreams of the loyalists might come true, and that imperial restoration was at hand. Certainly many a loyalist felt similarly. The shogun's visit led to a new round of loyalists flocking to the city of Kyoto, as did news that Kome would leave the grounds of the Gosho, the imperial palace complex, to pray for victory against the foreigners at the Kamigamo and Shimogamo shrines, the first time an emperor had left the grounds of the palace for any reason other than natural disaster in over 200 years. While in Kyoto, under pressure from Kome, Iemochi even agreed to set a date for the expulsion of foreigners to be implemented in late June of 1863. It was all, supposedly, finally happening. Except then it all really didn't, and instead, over the course of the next year and a half, the loyalist and expulsionist cause imploded in the most spectacular of fashions. Why that is remains a fascinating and contested historical question, and just to be upfront, I'm not going to try to cover it comprehensively because this is one of the most studied and storied periods in Japanese history, and the webs of alliance and counter-alliance are just way too complicated and involve throwing a lot of names at you. That said, when we take a zoomed-out perspective, I think there are a few things we can point to explain why things worked out the way they did for the loyalist movement. First and foremost, the position of the Tokugawa shogun, while weaker than it had been in a long time, was not as weak as many loyalists assumed. For a start, the journey by the shogun to the city of Kyoto, while it was a symbolic admission of weakness, was accompanied by a very real reassertion of shogunate authority in Kyoto. Concern that loyalists might attempt to attack the shogun himself led to some serious crackdowns within Kyoto, spearheaded by a Tokugawa family relative, Matsudaira Katamori, the daimyo of Aizu domain in northern Honshu, who was appointed Kyoto Shugoshoku, roughly the military commissioner of the city, and sent there in the fall of 1863 to reassert his family's position. Matsudaira Katamori did this mostly by moving his own forces from Aizu and forces supplied by the shogunate into Kyoto to crack down on loyalist disorder. The most famous of these groups was, of course, a force recruited primarily from Ronin to the shogunate cause, the newly selected corps, or Shinsengumi. These are probably some of the most romanticized figures in Japanese history, primarily because of the much later works of the historical novelist Shiba Ryotaro, whose novels on the Shinsengumi, most notably Moe Ken or Burn My Sword, were insanely popular and inspired like a bajillion spin-offs. The Shinsengumi and their romanticization are really interesting subjects in terms of the relationship of history and pop culture, especially in terms of how the ways we talk about history reflect our modern context more than actual events. But I regret to inform you that in this particular series, I'm not going to get into that much because, frankly, for the sweeping overall history of the period, they're not really that important. That said, if you're really interested in the subject, episode 464 is all about this very thing, so go check it out. More important, frankly, was the disposition of Emperor Kome in all of this, because many a loyalist assumed the emperor backed them wholeheartedly, and in fact, he did not. Kome was a staunch traditionalist. He shared the disdain of the loyalists for what he saw as Western imperialism, besmirching Japanese tradition and honor. But he was also a traditionalist in the sense that he believed in the traditional order. He wanted the imperial court to be stronger, yes, but still wanted a cooperative relationship with the shogunate and the warrior class, more akin to the dual governments of earlier years in terms of power than the complete overthrow of the Tokugawa system. So, for example, Kome was quite pleased to hear the Bakufu planned to implement an expulsion edict in the summer of 1863, but when rumors reached him that loyalists within the imperial court were planning to make him the commander of the forces carrying out the expulsion, to put Kome as the commander-in-chief of the military in essence, he was furious and had those loyalists removed from their positions and placed under house arrest. He was also eventually willing to listen to the shogunate's advice that despite their promise to carry out expulsion, such a plan wasn't really viable in the summer of 1863. He would never formally abandon the idea, but as cooler heads prevailed in the shogunate, he was at least willing to listen to their advice. Kome even repeatedly refused requests by Tokugawa Iemochi that, for his failures to ease the imperial mind, he be allowed to resign as shogun. One gets the impression that, while Kome disliked the imperious way the shogunate had treated the emperor and his court over the centuries, he didn't want to let the institution go, and in point of fact was more than prepared to drag the shogunate into the model he wanted for it, regardless of the desires of the Tokugawa leadership. Perhaps the single biggest issue the loyalists had, though, was that their ideology's most extreme adherents didn't really have a sense of how popular their beliefs actually were. Simply put, they believed loyalism was way more popular than it actually was. To be fair, that kind of magical thinking was part of the formula. As an example, we can turn to one of the loyalist parties that existed out in the feudal domains themselves, the Kinnoto or Imperial Reverence Party of Tosa Domain in Shikoku. Founded by the samurai Takechi Hanpeta, the Kinnoto membership took it upon themselves to propagate the ideology of loyalism in their native Tosa, but their methods for doing so were very unrealistic. For example, at one point, the Kinnoto membership had a discussion about how they would fund plans to expand the coastal defenses around the main castle town of their domain, Kochi, in preparation for war with the foreigners. The plan they settled on, and this is true, was to go to Tosa domain-aligned rice merchants in Osaka and ask for money, and if the money was not forthcoming, to commit suicide in front of the rice merchants one by one to show their sincerity until the rice merchants caved in. This plan was of course never implemented because it is completely insane, but it gives you a sense of the rhetoric that the loyalists would bandy about. One gets the impression, given the core constituency, very young members of the lower samurai class, whose prospects were never very good, that the movement was less about a realistic assessment of politics and more about a chance to proclaim defiance against a system they thought was unfair. Regardless, it turned out that not many of the people who actually held power were on board with a loyalist plan to tear down the existing regime and simultaneously trigger a massive international war where Japan would be hugely disadvantaged. For example, two domains with the most heavy loyalist presence in their leadership, Choshu domain in western Honshu and Mito domain in the far east, did go ahead with plans to follow the expulsion edict and drive all foreigners from Japan in 1863, but these were really the only two domains that actually made such an attempt, and both were disastrous for the loyalist cause. In Mito, loyalists did have support from lower samurai, but not from the domain leadership, and so attempted a rebellion against the domain government, which was swiftly crushed. In Choshu, loyalists actually did control the domain government, one of very few places where they did, and so Choshu tried to use its coastal fortifications to close the straits of Shimonoseki between Honshu and Kyushu, the major shipping lane connecting Osaka to the Asian mainland. And they were successful for a time, bombarding foreign ships that tried to cross the straits and driving them away, and even forcing back an American frigate and a pair of French warships that tried to make an issue of things. But then, in September 1864, a combined British, French, Dutch, American armada of 28 warships showed up off the coasts of Shimonoseki and blasted the absolute bejesus out of the shore defenses, after which point a group of French Marines landed, made their way up to the fortifications, and spiked the remaining cannons, stopping even to pose for a photo with their handiwork. This was not exactly the grand victory that many a loyalist had been counting on to carry out their revolutionary program. If anything, it undercut the notion that fighting the West would end in any outcome other than crushing defeat. Indeed, if any doubted that conclusion, they could look to Satsuma, another domain where defying Western imperialism didn't end well. Now, Satsuma was not in the same camp as Choshu and Mito. Its leadership was not openly loyalist. Satsuma did have a long history of anti-Tokugawa sentiment, but more as a result of a historical grudge from the domain government losing to Tokugawa Ieyasu during his rise to power than sympathy for the court. Supposedly, Satsuma samurai were taught to sleep with their feet pointing towards Edo Castle, an insulting gesture, and the New Year's ceremonies for the domain included an annual invocation, quote, never to forget the defeat at Sekigahara. However, in 1863, Satsuma found itself embroiled in a controversy with the West, thanks to something called the Richardson Incident. The whole thing got its start on September 14, 1862, when a group of British nationals, including a merchant named Charles Wilcox Richardson, were on an expedition near Namamugi in Kanagawa, right near the major foreign treaty port of Yokohama. Along the way, they encountered the armed retinue of Shimazu Hisamitsu, father of Satsuma Domain's daimyo, who was on his way to Edo. The British party refused to make way for the Shimazu samurai, which was the law during the Edo period, and when they refused to do so, the two sides got into a scuffle, and in said scuffle, 2 of the Brits were wounded. Richardson was killed. The British government, of course, demanded an apology from the shogunate and from Satsuma Domain, and an indemnity, basically a large cash payment. The shogunate agreed to both. Satsuma Domain would not, its leaders perhaps assuming they could just give the British a runaround and string them along until they gave up, and that the domain's remote position in southern Kyushu would protect them. The British, of course, responded to all of these delays and statements that Richardson's killers were on the lam and could not be found, and refusals to pay, in a calm, rational manner befitting the best examples of international politics. By which I mean they sent a fleet to Satsuma's main castle town of Kagoshima in the summer of 1863 and burned half of the city to the ground. Simply put, anyone who had illusions about the ability to militarily resist Western Empire as it existed in Asia in the 1860s was very harshly disabused of that notion, or they didn't live to tell the tale. Of course, not every loyalist died in this period of violence, but those who did make it through were largely disabused of the idea that they could make a fight of things against the West. Even military resistance to the shogunate proved more challenging than a lot of them had imagined. At the end of the disastrous, from the loyalist perspective, summer of 1864, imperial loyalist samurai from Choshu made one final push to seize control of the government. Convinced that the emperor's willingness to continue supporting the shogunate and to temporize on the expulsion question was a result of bad advice, the classic thing to blame when the emperor is beyond reproach, these loyalists hatched a plot. They were going to set a series of fires in Kyoto and take advantage of the chaos the fires would create in a city of wood and paper to rush the imperial palace and seize Emperor Komei. They would then secret the emperor back to Choshu, where, surrounded by true loyalists who would give him good advice, he could finally direct the expulsion of the foreigners and the overthrow of the shogunate. Of course, the whole notion was, to put it generously, completely nuts. There were a decent number of loyalists committed to the plan. It's hard to know numbers for sure, but possibly in the thousands, mostly from Choshu, but also some from other domains who deserted to join the plot. But they were up against a garrison of several tens of thousands of Tokugawa-aligned samurai, mostly from Aizu domain, and thus deeply loyal to the city's military commissioner, Matsudaira Katamori. Thus the coup was a disaster. It's known to history as the Kinmon or Hamaguri Gate incident, after the Hamaguri Gate of the Imperial Palace, also known as the Kinmon or Forbidden Gate, where most of the fighting took place. And in that fighting, the loyalists were driven back from the gate in short order and with many casualties, and while the fires they set were destructive, burning a huge swath of Kyoto, including thousands of homes, they didn't provide enough cover for the loyalists to even get over the walls of the palace complex. When the scale of Choshu involvement became clear, the Karo or domain elder was even implicated in the plot, the shogunate then responded by dispatching a punitive expedition to Choshu. The first Choshu expedition, as it became known, came together within slightly over a month of the attack on the imperial palace. The shogunate was able to quickly marshal a force from domains surrounding Choshu and crush the government. By November of 1864, Choshu's loyalists had surrendered, and the leaders responsible for Choshu's involvement in the loyalist movement had either died fighting or been ordered to commit suicide. And so in the span of just a few years, really from 1861 to the end of 1864, the loyalist movement came to great prominence and then imploded just as spectacularly. The mood went from one of imminent revolution to cautious optimism for supporters of the status quo. And yet things were not quite as cut and dried as they appeared for the loyalist movement. While many of their supporters were dead and the one domain where they held real power had been thoroughly humbled, the movement itself was not gone. Admittedly, those who were most committed to the idea of expelling foreign influence from Japan and reclosing the country at the first opportunity had seen it clearly demonstrated that this was not possible. The Allied fleet which reopened the Shimonoseki Straits and the British one which burnt Kagoshima demonstrated very clearly the superiority of Western weaponry for anyone who had doubts. But plenty of loyalists had survived these defeats and the subsequent purges and remained just as committed to the overthrow of the shogunate, albeit having accepted the necessity, for now, of relations with the West. And even before the disasters of 1864, not every loyalist was an avid expulsionist. By this time, after about a decade of foreign presence in Japan, many were aware of the strength of Western technology, especially weapons, and were coming around to the idea of using them in service to their cause. For example, among the many committed radical samurai of Choshu were two men from minor families known as Ito Hirobumi and Inoue Kaoru. Both had been students of Yoshida Shoin, one of the men executed in the Ansei purges, and both had been part of extremist loyalist groups which had assassinated their proclaimed enemies. But both also participated in a program put together by the domain government before the first Choshu expedition to break Bakufu law and go overseas. Along with three others, they were sent to the United Kingdom in 1863 to study at University College London and bring what they had learned of Western technology back to Japan. And this was illegal. It was a defiance of the Sakoku edicts, which were still on the books and forbade Japanese subjects from going overseas, but the domain leadership and all five samurai judged the risk worth the reward. Their example helps to demonstrate that while the most extreme wings of the loyalist movement could be, well, extreme in their anti-foreignism, not all loyalists were like that before 1864, and afterwards, well, pragmatism was the order of the day. And furthermore, it wasn't even like every loyalist had been rooted out either. Quite a few had, but others had gone to ground. For example, another Choshu domain loyalist and samurai who'd been part of the extremist movement and a student of Yoshida Shoin's by the name of Takasugi Shinsaku had been a major military leader for Choshu domain before 1864. After defeat, he took his followers and fled up into the mountainous interior of the domain, hoping to bide his time and then retake Choshu for the cause. I tell you all of this because I think it's important for explaining why, just 3 years after this pretty harsh defeat, the fortunes of the loyalist cause would swing once again. In our narrative, it is currently the winter of 1864. By the winter of 1867, the Tokugawa shogunate would come crumbling down. But that's a story for next time. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shoutout tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, an anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enrio's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, Jennifer Pianzio, James, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time for the downfall of feudalism in Japan.